Back before Brother Smith was here for Father's Day, we started the life of Job. We're in a series on brokenness, biographies of the broken. And if anyone was ever broken, surely it was Job. We'll be in that book, so you can start turning to the book of Job. 2 weeks ago, we looked at those initial chapters where he just gets hammered with all kinds of tragedy. And we used the metaphor of ocean waves that just keep pounding and pounding. And I talked about a child jumping in the surf of the ocean and how they have so much fun throwing themselves into the wave, but at the end of an hour, they're exhausted and sleep. But maybe sometimes you've seen on a more ragged coast, the ocean's waves dashing against the rock and eroding away this solid, massive rock. That's the power of waves. And in Job's life, he experienced waves of loss. We saw in those early chapters the loss of his wealth, as all his cattle and livestock and many of his servants were taken from him. The loss of everything that he had worked for, the loss even of his loved ones, as all of his children were killed in one day. We saw another wave of loss as his wife no longer could support him. We saw her give up on him and say, Job, it's not worth it anymore. Just curse God and die. We saw him with the wave of the loss of his own health. And then the loss of supportive friends who sat with him for a while, but eventually started to point the finger and say, this really probably is your fault. Nobody gets it this bad without deserving it. And so we saw that Job begins to be broken by this experience of wave after wave of loss. And I hated to end the message where we do, because it very much felt like part one. It felt like unfinished business. And then we had next Sunday with our special guest. And now here we are to really kind of tie it up and see the second part of the story. And I hope what we'll see today is it wasn't only the waves of loss that broke Job. It was something in the midst of the waves of constant loss. And it's a reminder to me that circumstances don't necessarily break anyone. And we've looked at, Moses and Jacob and the things that they went through. But you've probably known people like I have that go through a lot of stuff, but somehow they don't end up surrendered to the Lord. Even if they're Christians, they don't end up with a sweet, broken spirit. They somehow are bitter or strident, or they grit their teeth and I'm going to bulldog it through. And that is a choice that we have. It's not the choice that Job made, and I hope it's not the choice that we make. The Bible calls itself a mirror, and it reflects us so well far too often. And as I've surveyed again the life and the dialogue of Job, I see myself a lot in Job. In that, in some of his moments of loss, he's doing great. He's trusting God. He's worshiping Him in the midst of his loss. And then a little bit later, he's having a hard time trusting God. And then a little bit later, it's as if he rouses himself and his faith is strong again, and he worships the Lord. And then he sinks into despair again. And often this is our experience, isn't it? We're having these losses or these difficult circumstances. And in one moment, we might praise God. And then the next day, we're down, we're frustrated, we're discouraged. We're not surrendered to the Lord as we should be. And I hope by today's journey through Scripture, we'll kind of follow the biography of Job and this whole breaking process, where it wasn't just the waves in chapters 1 and 2. It was something more in the midst of the waves that really allowed him to be broken and fruitful and sweet at the end. So let's try not to review too long and head to chapter 3. Head to chapter 3. Job lost all those things. He lost his health. His friends came. They sat with him in mourning for about a week without saying anything. And then they begin to talk. And the way I read the account, as Job interacted with his friends and talked about his situation, his thoughts tended to decline. We read some beautiful verses in Job chapter 1, where it says he rent his mantle, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, "The Lord gave, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord." And that's where he is right after the crisis comes, right after the hammer falls. And sometimes, maybe you've been there. Something really, really difficult happens and you're still kind of in shock and you're able to say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then a couple days later, it really starts to sink in. And it's a little harder to worship and say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." And that's where we find Job. He's now, a week or two into his suffering. And his friends start jawing. And I think his thoughts and his perspective tend to decline. There are high points where he bounces back, but overall, he begins to drift downward in this process of processing the waves of loss. Because his friends continue to attack him and say, "Job, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault," which I'm not going to read those verses. That I just told you what you need to hear. Over and over again, they say, "Job, it's your fault." Job then feels the need to defend himself. Does that mirror work for you? When my friends tell me it's my fault, I feel the need to defend myself. And so chapter after chapter, Job's friends say, "You did this, and surely it's that and the other." And Job's like, "No, really, guys, I haven't done this and I haven't done that. And in fact, here are the good things that I did." And in that simple process of honestly, I believe, truthfully defending himself, it takes him to a place he should not go mentally and spiritually. And now in his defensiveness, he gets a small view of God and a big view of himself. And whenever you're there, you're in a bad place. He sees himself as good because he's just listed off his credentials to his friends in self-defense. And then he gets discouraged and wonders where God is in all of this. Towards the end, he does switch back to a high view of God and a low view of himself. And that's where we need to end. We're human. We're going to stumble. We're going to get discouraged. There's going to be times when we don't handle our waves of loss properly. But I hope by seeing Job's biography, by looking in the mirror of Job's life, we can see, when I defend myself and when I talk about my good points, then I'm actually not seeing God for how great he is, and I'm still in trouble. But when I have that change of perspective and see God's grandeur, then I know that I just need to close my mouth and stop making myself look good. That's the summary I would submit of these chapters upon chapters of dialogue between Job and his friends. So my goal then is to kind of summarize for you the progression of the discussion of Job and his friends, and we'll read some verses to illustrate some of those points, and then we'll come to the practical application at the end. So hang on, it'll get there. Just 3 simple things that we can do when we're in a situation like this. So start with me, please, at verse 3 of chapter 3. We're going to see Job now telling how he feels. He flat out says is that he wishes he had never been born. That's a pretty big statement. And then he says, well, since I was born, I wish God would kill me now. That's also a pretty big statement. And throughout all of these chapters, he continues to say, but I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. Look, please, Job 3:3. Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it is said, there is a man-child conceived. Come now to chapter 6, verse 8. Chapter 6, verse 8. He says, I wish I was never born. Chapter 6, verse 8. Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for, even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Put me out of my misery, God. I wish I could die. So he wishes he was never born. He wishes he could die. But through all of it, he defends himself. So I'm going to, for one time, I'm going to ask you to skip way ahead to chapter 33. Chapter 33, verse 8. This is the one time for today that I'm going to read to you from Job's friends. This is Elihu, the one who came at the end, who actually said a lot of things that sound wise. God did condemn him, but he does state some true things. But I want you to hear Elihu's summary of Job's speeches. Okay, so Job will talk for a chapter or two, then one of his friends will talk, and then Job will talk for a chapter. It's like that. And Elihu says, here's what I'm hearing from you, Job. This is what you're saying. Job 33, verse 8. Elihu summarizes Job's speech this way. Surely thou hast spoken in mine hearing, and I have heard the voice of thy word, saying, quote, this is what Job said. This is Elihu's summary of it. I am clean without transgression. I am innocent. Neither is there iniquity in me. That's a pretty big statement that Job makes about himself. So he says, I wish I had never been born. I wish I could die. And I'm innocent. That's kind of an overview. Now come back to chapter 9. We'll hit a few chapters and see kind of the development or the progression of Job's thoughts as he floats back and forth in this season of loss. The sad circumstances weren't enough to finish the job of sanctification, but they set him up for it. Job chapter 9, verse 2. At this point, Job actually has a pretty good view about himself and about God, but the problem is he doesn't stay here. Okay, so Job chapter 9, verse 2. I know it is so of a truth, but how should man be just with God? If he will contend with him, he cannot answer him 1 of 1,000. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who hath hardened himself against him and hath prospered? Do you see, Job is saying, I can't be just in God's sight. I cannot answer 1 of 1,000 questions he might give, which is actually interesting considering how the book ends. He says, God is wise in heart. God is mighty in strength. And anyone who hardens himself against God does not prosper. That's about right, Job. You're on the right track. But Job doesn't stay there. Turn to chapter 12. I'm not throwing Job under the bus. He's so much more noble than I. But you know how it is when your friends keep dogging you. And he continues to endure the accusation of his friends. And he gets frustrated with them. And I think what happens is he lets his frustration with his friends bleed over into his view of God. And now it's defense mode, and it turns into not just defense against my friends, it's defense against God. And sometimes the line between defending yourself and attacking your opponent is very, very narrow. And so Job lives in this dangerous place of defending himself against his friends, attacking his friends, justifying himself before God, and he gets really close to attacking God. And this is what we must avoid. Job chapter 9. I'm sorry, 12. Job 12. Here we see Job getting frustrated with his friends. And Job answered and said, no doubt, but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Yea, who knoweth not such things as these? Okay, now, in a heavy and sad message, this is the time to laugh a little bit. Job is being very sarcastic with his friends. Verse 2, he says, oh, you are the man, and wisdom is going to die with you. You see what he's saying? He's saying, you all are spouting off your wisdom to me as if like you're the most wise people. You know everything. And when you die, there won't be any wisdom left. He says, excuse me, I have wisdom too. And the things that you guys are saying, everybody knows that. He is frustrated with his friends. I don't know if you ever like sign Christmas cards and put a little Bible verse at the bottom. You might think about putting, Job chapter 12, verse 2. No doubt, but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you. Then you'll find out whether they actually look up the reference or not. It's funny for us here and now in our air conditioning and comfortable lives, isn't it? Job has had it up to here. They go, oh, you think you know so much. I have wisdom too, It continues in chapter 13. Chapter 13, Job is still frustrated with his friends. Lo, mine eye hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard and understood it. What ye know, the same do I know also. I am not inferior unto you. Do you see that frustration, that pushback? You guys keep dogging me, and I'm telling you, I am not beneath you. I know what you know. But watch now, where he goes with that frustration about his friends and his defensive posture towards his friends. Now he says in verse 3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. But ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. He basically says the smartest thing you could say is to shut your mouth. You're like a doctor that can't help. You just need to be quiet because all the advice you're giving is wrong. I want to talk to God about this. I want to reason with him because you all are no good. And you see now how in his frustration and defensiveness, he's beginning to creep up on frustration with God rather than the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we receive evil at the hand of the Lord and not good? Do you see how the attitude is different? And sometimes when wave after wave hits me and then I'm discouraged and I have to defend myself, I can get there too. Look at chapter 13. Again, we're going to see verse 13 of chapter 13. He's trusting God, but he wants to prove himself right. Chapter 13. Hold your peace. Let me alone that I may speak, and let come on me what will. I got to say what I got to say. I don't care what happens. You ever felt like that? I can't hold it in any longer. I got to get this out, and I don't care what happens. I've got to say what's on my heart. By the way, that's usually a really good time to not say what you want to say. Verse 14, wherefore do I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in mine hand? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. I'm going to trust him. But I'm telling you, my ways are right, and I'm going to maintain that position. No one is going to make me say that I'm wrong. I am innocent in my suffering. So he does trust God, but he still wants to prove himself. Now chapter 16, please. We continue to see this progression from frustration with friends, defensiveness, and now his relationship with God is affected. Chapter 16. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. Shall vain words have an end? Or what emboldeth thee that thou answerest? I also could speak as ye do. If your soul were in my soul's stead, I could heap up words against you and shake mine head at you. Do you hear the hurt and the anger? You are doing a terrible job of comforting me. And if anything bad ever happens to you, I could say all these things back to you. Verse 11. God hath delivered me to the ungodly and turned me over into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he hath broken me asunder. He's broken me in half. He hath also taken me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. Have you ever seen a dog do that? Or a cat? They'll get a mouse or a little rabbit or a squirrel, take them by, shake it to pieces. And then he says, and set me up for his mark. His archers compass me round about. In other words, God made a bullseye target out of me. God's like, let me make Job the target. Okay, everybody shoot at Job. If you hurt him, that's good. You see what he's accusing God of? He's delivered me to the ungodly. He's turned me over to the wicked. He broke me in half. He's taken me by my neck and shaken me to pieces. He's made me a bullseye for the archers. He cleaveth my reins asunder. Reins is a reference like to your innards, your kidneys. He's cut my insides and doth not spare. He poureth my gall upon the ground. He spilled my guts. Do you see how graphic Job is being? And who is he saying did all of this? God. God, you did this, and you did this, and you did this, and you did this. Bible is a mirror, isn't it? How many times has that been the attitude of my heart? God, you did this to me. God, you could have stopped that. And God, why did you let that? You've taken me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. You've made me the bullseye. God, it's not fair. And he's almost treating his God like he treats his friends. That's never a good idea. Verse 14. He breaketh me. We are talking about brokenness, aren't we? He breaketh me with breach upon breach. He runneth upon me like a giant. He's pounding waves. He's a giant. And now, notice, it's one thing to just say, God's been tough on me. Look at verse 17. Not for any injustice in my hands. Also, my prayer is pure. Verse 21. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleadeth for his neighbor. Oh, I wish I could plead with God about all this. He's done all this to me and I'm innocent and I wish I could tell him. I'm not saying I'm any better than Job, but you see the frustration and the defensiveness seeping into his attitude towards God. And that is a drastic mistake, because God is not Bildad or Elihu. God is God. And the difference between Job and God is infinite. And Job crosses a line. Chapter 23, please. No, sorry. Chapter 21, he cries about how the wicked prosper. He says in verse 7, wherefore do the wicked live and become old? In other words, they live long. Yea, are mighty in power. So now he's complaining about the wicked prospering. Job did have a pretty good chapter in chapter 19. He talks about how he trusts God even though God did all these terrible things to him. But chapter 23, I think, is pretty close to the low point in Job's expression of his feelings, his mournings, his grief, his whatever you want to call it. Job 23, verse 3. And I understand, I have to put a tone of voice into this. It's a written word. And I could be reading this not perfectly in tune with Job's heart. But based on the dialogues as a whole, this is how I think Job was speaking. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would order my cause before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say unto me. Now, that can be read with a much more gentle and penitent tone. It can be. But based on the rest of Job's words, I think he's flustered. I think God, I wish I could talk to God. I would hear what he would say back to me. I think he's exasperated. To his credit, in chapter 28, he acknowledges the foolishness of man and the wisdom of God. That's always a good thing to do. So come to chapter 28, please. Chapter 28, he acknowledges the foolishness of man and the wisdom of God. Verse 12. Where shall wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Man knoweth not the price thereof, neither is it found in the land of the living. God understandeth, that's verse 23. Drop down to verse 23. God understandeth the way thereof, and he knoweth the place thereof. And verse 28. And unto man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and depart from evil is understanding. So Job still knows the truth. Right? And don't we often know the truth, but then our feelings wrestle with God? And I think that's where he is. He knows God is wise, but it just doesn't feel good right now. In chapter 29, Job does something else that's not really healthy when you're hit by the waves of loss. He remembers how good it used to be. You remember how the good old days, don't you? Yeah. The wise man said, don't talk about the good old days. They weren't. There's nothing new under the sun. It's always been bad. Oh, it's so bad these days. Actually, it's been bad all days since the fall. But Job is harking back to more pleasant circumstance. Job chapter 29, verse 2. Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon mine head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when the Almighty was yet with me," implying he's not with me anymore. "And my children were about me." Of course, his children had been tragically killed. So Job thinks back to how good it used to be, and then in chapter 30, he accuses God of doing all this to him. Job chapter 30, verse 19. 30:19. Speaking of God, he says, "He hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me." Maybe you felt that way before. But we need to be careful about calling God cruel. In chapter 31, Job wants a trial. And he continues to declare his own goodness. Throughout all of this, he's hung up on all the good deeds I've done and all the bad deeds I haven't done. He's very works-focused. And it's good that he was good, but it's not enough. Even for our salvation today, it's good if you're good, but it's not enough. Only Christ's perfection can satisfy the wrath of God. And that's why we have to ask him to save us and not think, well, I'll just start being better. I'll start a new habit. I'll be a good person. It's not enough to pay for the sins already done. Our goodness is never enough. And even for us, if we are believers, we can never say, well, I don't deserve to suffer because I'm a good person. I want a fair trial here. It's not a good place to go. Job chapter 31, verse 6. "Let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity." He's saying, if I could be put on a just scale, God would see how good I am. Job, brother, God knows everything about you. Don't say, if only I could get a fair trial, God would see my integrity. And then for the rest of his chapter, he just talks about how good he's been, and he uses the word I over and over again. Look at me and how good I am. And then in verse 35, "Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book." At this point, the best I can understand Job's words, he views God too much like an equal who owes him an explanation. And it's easy for us to do the same. The distance between God and us shrinks way too often. If my peer, maybe it's a coworker or a neighbor or a family member, if my peer does something that doesn't make sense to me and it seems unkind or whatever, I might go up and say, "Hey man, what is that all about? What'd you do that for?" I don't understand. Tell me what's going on here. Because we're equals. And justice puts us on the same plane. We're not on the same plane with God. And you can't march up to him and say, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" You can't plead with him and say, "Hey, don't you know who I am? Don't you remember all the good things I've done? Come on, put my works in a scale and you'll see." Like, you can't talk to God that way. He's God. And in our natural, physical, modern, we can explain everything through science world. We sometimes forget that God is supernatural. He is above everything you know. You're nothing. He's God. Watch your attitude. I believe, though Job did admirably in these adverse circumstances, he pressed the line on questioning God And I think ultimately it's because he thought too highly of himself and therefore could not think high enough of God. I want us to see in the last couple chapters what finally broke Job. It wasn't the death of his children. It wasn't the loss of his livestock or his health. Job was ultimately broken by his confrontation with God and his response to a new view of God. And if in your circumstances you don't want your pain to be wasted, you need to come face to face with God and see him rightly in the midst of your suffering. And see yourself rightly in the midst of your suffering. In Job chapter 38, God begins to question Job about things he doesn't know or understand. If you've read the book of Job at all, you remember this passage. God shows up and he says, Job, you wanted to see me? Let's talk. And he peppers him with question after question after question after question that Job cannot answer. This goes on for a while. For sake of time, come please now to chapter 40. I'm so glad that in the book of Job, we don't just see the trials, we don't just see the dialogue, we see God and Job interface. And let me challenge you with this. If you're feeling loss today, if the waves are pounding you, let your losses lead you to the Lord. It just kind of worked out that way with all those L's, so maybe it'll help us remember it. Okay, listen again. Let your losses lead you to the Lord. Your losses are wasted if you try to make it on your own, if you try to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and buck up and chin up and I can make it. No. Let your losses lead you to the Lord, like Job experienced here. Chapter 40, God continues to humble Job. Verse 1, moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Job is finally getting the point, and he answers this way in verse 4. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Does that sound like the other chapters? I would fill my mouth with arguments. I would hear what he would say to me. It's pretty different now, isn't it? Because God showed up and Job saw him for what he is. And so he basically says in the summarized version, I'm going to shut up now. Have you ever been in a situation where you were saying things and you didn't know the whole story, and when you found something else, like, yeah. That's the way we should always be when it comes to God. He is God in heaven. You are upon earth. Let your words be few. So that's step number one in dealing with the losses that seem they will overwhelm you. Close your mouth. Close your mouth. Maybe it's not your words, but maybe it's your self-talk. Maybe it's your internal conversation. I tend to do like Job. I tend to defend myself. When hardship comes, when loss, when accusation, I throw up all the good things about me. And I just need to stop. I don't need to say how good I am. Close your mouth. I can stop rehearsing my woes. That was another thing Job talked about. I've done all these good things and now I've lost this and this has happened to me. And he complains about all his hard things. And when you're facing loss and you're suffering, and if you're going to be broken and turn to God, you need to stop rehearsing your woes. Woe is me. I have it so difficult. Stop it. What do you think you deserve? I'm not minimizing your loss. I'm minimizing all of our losses compared to what we actually deserve, right? Stop defending yourself. Stop rehearsing your woes. I've got it so bad. It's not fair. Why is everybody picking on me? Close your mouth. And here's a tough one. Stop demanding answers. If I could summarize the book of Job, it might be to say that you learn that you have to be okay with unanswered questions. Job had all these questions, and he needed to learn to accept no answer. Close your mouth. Job said, once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. He said in verse 4, I will lay my hand on my mouth. In your suffering, shut your mouth before you say something you shouldn't say. Verse 6, God's not finished with Job. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? So my interpretation of Job is not solely my own. God himself says, Job, really, you're going to condemn me and say that you're innocent? I think you've got that backwards. So I would suggest to us a second thing that we need to do when responding to these losses is to see God as he really is. Drop down now to chapter 42 and we'll see Job finally gets there. Job 42 verse 1. God says, are you going to condemn me so that you can look good, so that you can be righteous? Verse 1 of chapter 42, Job is getting the idea now. Job 42, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. God asked Job all those questions, and Job got the point. You can do everything, and you know everything. I understand. In your times of loss, acknowledge your God. Acknowledge his power. Acknowledge his right to do whatever he wants to do. And acknowledge his wisdom. Those questions that God peppered Job with demonstrate those things. I'm God. I can do what I want to. I have all the power, and I have all the wisdom. And you are in no position to question me. So when you're suffering in time of loss, close your mouth. Acknowledge your God. I mean, really acknowledge him as God. As terrible, as awesome, as fearful, as wonderful, as beautiful, as immense, as pervasive, as everything. God is God, and don't you forget it. And when you sit before him, it changes your perspective, not only on your circumstances, it changes your perspective on yourself. Suddenly you're no longer saying, but guys, I'm innocent, I'm really good, I help the poor people, and I'm a nice person, and I don't look at people with lust. You're not saying any of that anymore. You're saying God is awesome. So he said, I know that thou canst do everything, and no thought can be withholden from thee. And then verse 3. Job he's feeling badly about what he's done. He first of all quotes God here in verse 3. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? He's quoting God, and he's embarrassed. He's like, it was me. I was the one who was hiding counsel without knowledge. I was the one who didn't know what he was talking about and questioned God. Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. I said a bunch of things that I didn't know what I was talking about. It's me, God. I'm the guilty one who shot off his mouth. Now verse 4, here I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. Now Job is quoting himself. He's saying, this is what I used to say, and I'm embarrassed that I said these things, but I said, hear me, I will speak, I will demand, and give me an answer. Job says, God, you asked who is shooting off their mouth, and it was me. And I said things like, I'm going to demand of you, and I regret it so much. Verse 5, here's the key. Catch all of this. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. I can get lippy with God when I focus on my good works and whine about my trials. But when I see God as God, I'm going to abhor myself, and I'm going to be sorry for what I've said. And I'm going to say, God, whatever you want, you're God. I'll just sit down and be quiet now. So number one, we need to close our mouth. Number two, we need to acknowledge our God. Number three, we need to humble ourselves. Humble ourselves. If you are fighting God in a time of loss, if you're not broken and surrendered, it's because you need to humble yourself. And stop talking about what you deserve and not thinking you know so much. And remember the gap between you and God. And just let him be God. Stop trying to be a peer with him. Stop trying to argue with him. I'm happy to be able to remind you of the end of the story. In chapter 42, verse 12, we find out that God blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. And he had double the animals, and he had 10 more children. Aren't you glad for that? God broke Job. Waves of losses drowned him out. And then he had an encounter with the Almighty and realized his smallness. He learned that he needed to close his mouth. He learned that he needed to humble himself and he needed to acknowledge his God. And when all that happened, God says, all right, now Job, you're fit for my blessing. I can't promise you material prosperity like God gave to Job, but I can tell you that Job carried with him for the rest of his good long life a deeper, more profound, more proper relationship with God than he had ever had before. I want you to think about that. At the beginning, Job is an upright man. He escheweth evil and he walks with God. But now that he's had this encounter, he has so much more depth to his relationship with God. He has so much a better idea of how to truly worship. That's what I want. I hope it doesn't take this much to get there. But when you're suffering the waves of loss, if you will come face to face with God and accept him for who he is and abhor yourself and repent in dust and ashes and lay your hand upon your mouth, then God can bless you. Acknowledge the wisdom of God. Admit your lack of ability, and then await the blessing of God. David said, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. You might not get thousands of livestock and you might not have 10 more kids, but you'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Don't defend yourself. Trust in him. Father, these are hard lessons to learn. And I don't mean to beat up anybody that's already suffering. But I pray that in our times of loss, whether it's current or future, you will help us to have a humble spirit that does not question you, that does not defend ourselves and talk about what we think we deserve. Help us to come face to face with you and sit down and be quiet. Please. Please prepare us so that we can be blessed.